Hi everyone. In this video I am going to provide a few examples of the shift that occurred from medieval ways of thinking to the Renaissance. I'll draw on music and on visual art in this lecture, and then in the next lecture I'll talk to you a bit about writing. So let's start with some music. Listen to this short section of medieval dance music called estampi. I chose this to show you that all medieval music was not Gregorian chants. People actually did manage to have a little bit of fun as well in the medieval period. Right, so this was from a piece called La Rota, an example of estampi music. Now we fast forward about 400 years to the Baroque era. Listen to this piece from Vivaldi's Concerto for Oboe and Strings in A minor. Okay, take a minute to think about why these two pieces sound so different. Even if you know nothing about music, the first piece probably sounded kind of old to you, right? And the second piece more modern. And I'll put old and modern in scare quotes. What is the difference? How would you explain it apart from just saying that the musical instruments are different? The most important difference is probably this. In the estampi music, all the instruments were doing more or less the same thing. Listen to it again if you want. You have several instruments playing at the same time, and they're all playing the same tune. In the Vivaldi piece, the overall effect is harmonious, but the instruments are doing different things. You have different tunes playing at the same time. Now, before music lovers decide to shoot me, let me just put it in proper terms. You'd say in Vivaldi the instruments are independent in contour and rhythm, but interdependent in harmony. That's to say, we have different voices working together. This was true not just in music, but in all art forms. The Renaissance, we could say, allowed for polyphony. Polyphony simply means many voices. Poly and phony, many voices, polyphony. For instance, in Boccaccio's Decameron, which I have talked to you about, or in English, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, you have different voices working together to create a whole. Different perspectives and subjectivities are mixed together. Medieval art, in contrast, is much more monolingual or monovocal. That is, there's one dominant voice, whether we are talking about music or writing or visual art. And this, in turn, reflects a larger shift in the way people understood the world and their place in it. In the Renaissance, there's a new appreciation of difference and of relativity. So instead of one dominant truth, different ways of seeing and understanding are able to occupy the same space. We can recognize this as a more, quote, modern, unquote, perspective. In other words, an approach that we can relate to and that we are used to ourselves. Let me show you now how this plays out in visual art. Here is a fairly typical medieval painting of the Mother Mary and the Christ child. There you see Mary and she has Jesus on her lap. And here's a Renaissance painting of St. Francis of Assisi. Now, yet again, as with the music, the second painting probably seems more modern to you. Why is that? Well, first of all, the body in the second painting is more anatomically correct, right? Look at the Christ child in the first picture. It looks as if the painter just took an adult body and shrunk it. Kids have bigger heads than this depiction of Christ in the painting. We could say that there's a new focus on the individual human body rather than the social and religious body. The individual body becomes more important in the Renaissance. And this incidentally is also a reflection of what I referred to as humanism before, a renewed interest in the human body and the human mind. A philosophy that places the human being in all its forms and capacities at the very center of the world. The other thing that we notice in the Renaissance painting is the introduction of perspective. In other words, things in the foreground are larger and things in the background are smaller. Now, if you think about it, perspective also assumes a human gaze. We're seeing the world the way it would look to a human being who is standing in a certain position. Even in a painting with no human beings, right, there's an implicit person, the one who is looking, who is positioned relative to the objects being apprehended. You could almost say that the artist lends us his or her eyes. We occupy the same place as the artist, seeing the world from his point of view or her point of view. Another way of saying this would be that paintings with perspective contain a subject, a person. They are subjective in the normal sense of the word, but they are also arranged around an individual, a subject, an individual point of view, one that is by definition relative. The same scene would look very different if it were painted from the perspective of St. Francis or the perspective of the donkey or some invisible person in the background. So at a formal level, we're seeing this self that I talked about in the last lecture, an autonomous individual with a unique perspective on the world. That's fundamentally what the idea of perspective implies. There's a self who is looking, a human person. The medieval painting is, of course, painted from the perspective of God, or at least their idea of God. They're not painting anatomically incorrect people because they're stupid, but because human anatomy is simply not considered particularly important. What is important for medieval artists is the connection between elements insofar as it reveals God's plan and the way in which God organizes the world. It's also not that medieval people simply didn't know that perspective existed, right? It was simply that perspective was a human thing, and the job of the painter was to reveal the way God sees the world, not the way human beings see the world. God is not constrained by perspective. Medieval paintings, in fact, have what we call a hieratic scale, H-I-E-R-A-T-I-C. The more important something is in a medieval painting, the bigger it is, which explains why the Virgin is quite big compared to the angels, and the Christ child is also very large in the picture. In this sense, you can say that Renaissance art becomes more mimetic. In other words, it begins to copy reality. You see this in the writing as well. And it's not God's reality that's being copied, but human reality. In medieval art, in contrast, you tend to see a symbolic representation. Things represent other things. They're a little bit like dreams, intricately coded visions that require interpretation and decoding in order to be properly understood. There are also symbols in Renaissance art, but they are more hidden. Like in this picture, you see the skull here near the frame of the picture, which is called the memento mori, and it's supposed to remind us of the transience of life and the fact that we are all mortal beings who will eventually die. But you can see it's relegated to a marginal place. It's not the focus of the picture. It's almost hidden. You'll also notice in Renaissance art that even though the themes remain religious, there's a new close attention to the natural landscape and to ordinary things. Look how the background becomes bigger and more detailed, again, if you compare these two pictures. It's almost as if the artist is more interested in the world beyond the central figure than in St. Francis himself. It's depicted in a lovingly textured, careful way. Now, this can also be understood in relation to the growth of humanism. Ordinary, real, everyday things are almost beginning to push the big mythical religious themes to the margins. If God were at the very center of the medieval world, the human world slowly begins to displace this theocentric universe, this medieval theocentric idea of the cosmos. Here's a lovely example. It's Bruegel's famous Fall of Icarus. You know the story, Icarus flew too close to the sun and his wings melted and he fell to earth. Well, can you find Icarus in this picture? Take a moment, see if you can find Icarus. Alright, I'm taking my arrow to Icarus. Do you see those little legs? Where he's just fallen into the water? That's Icarus over here. The artist seems to be saying, look, even though this enormous mythical thing happened, normal life continues. The ships are still sailing, commerce continues, farmers are working on their land. It's almost as if the fall of Icarus becomes something unimportant from a larger, more all-encompassing human perspective. W.H. Auden, incidentally, wrote a lovely poem about this painting. It's called the Musée des Beaux-Arts. About suffering, says Auden, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position. How it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not especially want it to happen, skating on a pond or at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course, anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to, on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a buoy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. Alright, in the next lecture I will talk to you specifically about what happened to writing in the Renaissance, and then we will finally move on to Shakespeare's Tempest as an example of a Renaissance play. And I will try to pick up some of these themes that I've introduced so far.